Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Laura De Palma, the Marketing Manager at Renew International. And I'm really thrilled that you're all here with us today and to be introducing Chris Lowney. Before we get started, I would just like to mention a few brief housekeeping items. We are first going to start with a presentation from Chris Lowney, and then we'll have a brief opportunity for small group discussions, followed by a broader Q&A. I do ask that you keep your microphones muted just until the small group discussion portion so that we don't have any ambient noise and we can all hear everybody very clearly. Also, please keep an eye on the chat box. If you have any questions that occur to you as we go through the presentation, definitely feel free to leave them in that box, and I'll be taking notes on that so that we can bring them up during the Q&A at the end. There may also be a few other opportunities for sharing your thoughts, so definitely feel free to use that as much as you like. And finally, if you have any technical issues, definitely feel free to drop those in the chat box as well, and I will do what I can to help you navigate them. Without further ado, it is now my pleasure to introduce the great Chris Lowney. A one-time Jesuit seminarian, Chris Lowney now chairs the board of CommonSpirit Health, the nation's largest Catholic healthcare system with 140 plus hospitals in 21 states. Previously, Chris served as a managing director of JP Morgan & Co. on 3 continents. He has also authored some half-dozen books, including the best-selling Heroic Leadership, Best Practices from a 450-year-old Company That Changed the World, and Pope Francis, Why He Leads the Way He Leads. His most recent work is Everyone Leads, How to Revitalize the Catholic Church, and he also holds his BA and MA from Fordham University, grew up in Queens, New York, hates the Yankees, and roots for the Mets without feeling shame, much like myself. Chris has also frequently partnered with Renew, and he authored What Me Holy, which is a resource that is often used in a lot of our small group faith sharing communities. And he's also going to be one of our keynote speakers at the upcoming workshop on balancing faith and work, which is taking place at Seton University on Saturday, March 9th. And definitely stay tuned.
Welcome back. So
we'll have a link available so that you can explore that further if you'd like to. And without further ado, I am now thrilled to turn it over to Chris Lowney. Thank you so much for being here, everyone, and thank you, Chris, for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Laura. While I'm saying hello, you could bring up the cover slide, Laura, and thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for the help. And I will talk maybe like for about 35 minutes, and then, as Laura said, we'll have a little bit of time, 3 or 4 minutes for you to share some observation in a small group, and then we'll have open forum Q&A. And let me say, you'll see on this cover slide, there's my email address and some of my social contacts, and you're very welcome to have the slides. If you want them, just send me an email. I'll be happy to send them to you. Or I write monthly something for Forbes, and I send out an email address, an email once a month to mention those new articles. And if you want to be on that mailing list, contact me. And I guess that's about all I want to say by way of intro, except maybe I could give you the very big picture of the story that I think I'm going to tell. And it's basically something like this. 1, life is way more complicated now. We all have to make lots of decisions. 2, humans are not very good at making decisions. But 3, our spirituality actually gives us some wonderful tools that we often overlook that are going to help us to be really good decision makers. So that will be the flow of how we go through things here. And in a way, you know, in more general terms, part of the pitch I'm going to be making is we have this horrible modern tendency to kind of lead split lives. Like, in other words, one bucket in our head is, oh yeah, that's like religious, spiritual stuff, prayer stuff. But that's not like the real world. That's like different stuff. And so I have different behaviors, different ways of thinking. And I just don't think it's, 1, very satisfying. But 2, it's not very productive or useful either. In other words, we're laying aside sometimes spiritual tools that could help us, and the program that that Laura introduced on March 9th is going to delve into more of this stuff. Okay, now with that, let's get going. Let's have a little quiz. If we were here in person, I'd invite you on the next page, Laura. I'd invite us all to raise our hands in answer to these questions. But since we're not all in person, if you want, you could type a yes or a no into the chat box, and even an observation or two if you have one. So let's think about the world today and the world 10, 15, 20 years ago. You think the world today is faster paced? Is it more complex? In the course of managing your life or in your organizational life, do you have to cope with more change, make more decisions? If you want to type in your answer, by all means do so. I'm not going to wait very long because I know what the answer is. I ask this question a lot of times with groups, and always 90% plus of people say, oh man, this is a stupid question. Of course the world is faster, way more complex, way more difficult. And on the next slide, Laura, the military gave us a great acronym to describe the kind of world we're living in today. They say we're living in a world that's grown VUCA. In other words, it's V, volatile, U, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. They came up with this acronym to describe battlefield conditions. It's what it feels like when we drop you around into a battlefield. Hard to see what's going on, hard to understand the future. Change is quick. But I talked to a lot of groups in all kinds of industries, and people always say, yes, this military acronym describes the way I feel about my life. And this is, to me, the baseline reality, the kind of context for everything else I'm going to develop. And, you know, one of the implications of VUCA is that it makes all of us make a lot of decisions. Because if stuff is changing around us, sometimes we have to change. Should I go this way, that way, start a new role, do the things I do differently? And, you know, it's not real easy to do that well. The next slide has a little quip that a chaos mathematician told us: most successful people I know are good at plan B. In other words, in the old days, we all used to make a strategy for our life or for the organization. We kind of imagined that's going to be good for like 3 years, 5 years. We'll just put it into practice. Nowadays, okay, forget it. I mean, hopefully the vision, the core values, that stuff hopefully remains. But in terms of the plan that we thought we would put in practice, chances are, okay, I start out today, there's a curveball next month, COVID comes along, there's an inflation crisis, all these things that make us resort to plan B. And part of personal effectiveness is being good at plan B. If you want a more graphic, straightforward visualization of what modern life gives to us, it's on the next slide, Laura. Mike Tyson is not exactly the most admirable figure on earth, but he has this very clever quote that I use here. Before one of his fights, some reporter came up to him and said, oh, Mr. Tyson, so-and-so said they have a plan to beat you. What do you say to that? And Tyson says, everyone's got a plan till they get punched in the face. And in a way, this is what life keeps doing to us. COVID was a punch in the face. Inflation, a punch in the face. The drop-off, for example, in attendance at our parishes, punch in the face, whatever it may be. And we need the resilience and ingenuity to cope with that. And on the next slide, Laura, we'll see that, in fact, human beings are not very good at making decisions and coping with change. I'm not going to read this whole slide by any means. I'll just summarize it. And if you want, as I told you at the beginning, just send me an email. I'll send you the whole deck of slides. So McKinsey did this survey of very senior executives, asking them about the quality of strategic decision-making in their companies. And look at this punchline in the middle. 60% thought that bad decisions were about as frequent as good ones. I mean, that's an incredible confession to make. I mean, it's kind of saying, you know something, if we got a pigeon and could give it a binary choice, A or B, a pigeon would get at least 50% right. So we humans have a lot of frailties when it comes to making decisions. And I'm going to be developing the idea that our discernment tools are going to help us a lot. And when I say that, I'm not saying, nor do I think any advocate of good discernment practices says, that means throw rational decision-making good practice into the garbage. It means nothing like that. The next slide, Laura, outlines, one of very many classic frameworks for how you reach a good decision. And this is how we need to operate, of course. And I'm not going to go through all these steps. They're kind of intuitive. I just will make the observation that often in life, you'll see that evaluating options comes way down this decision waterfall. But often what happens in life is somebody shows up with a specific idea. Should we add this to the curriculum? Should we add this new program in the parish? Should we do this capital campaign? And we jump all the way down toward the end of the waterfall here without ever stopping to go back and think about some of the basic ideas about, well, gee, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? And what's the relevant information, what the options may be, and so on. So even though I'm not going to go through this, I guess I am saying for those of us in schools, parishes, companies, we need to make sure that we're at least following good practice. And now I want to suggest that we can amplify good practice by weaving into it some of the hallmarks of what might constitute a good discernment. And we could take a look at the next slide, Laura. These are some of the ideas that I'm going to slowly march us through now, that we pray at critical inflection points in the process, that we be indifferent to the outcome. I'll explain what that idea means, that we pay attention to our mission, values, Catholic social teaching, that we have moments of quiet reflection. Maybe after we've laid out the options, we don't jump right away to a debate, a discussion. Maybe we take a few minutes and think about it. Maybe we take a few hours if we have that. Maybe we even take a week of prayer over the options. And so on. I'm going to go through all these ideas as we go forward. As a mental model, you could say, all right, Chris is telling me that on the next slide, we have a kind of a rational way of approaching decisions, and we're going to try to look for opportunities to weave good spiritual discernment practices into a good rational framework. But before I get into any of those particular things, let me just say that it's probably worth thinking about the whole idea of discernment. I guess a lot of you are in the Christian tradition. Maybe you're very invested in your spiritual life. And so probably this word discernment gets tossed around a lot. And there are some very well-grounded, but also some really kooky ideas floating around about what discernment means. I mean, I sometimes hear people talk about discernment as if it's like the opposite of a rational good process. In other words, it's one thing to make a good rational decision, but I'm going to throw all that out the window and then see how I feel and say that's my discernment. And I think that's a badly misunderstood notion of the idea. If we go to the next slide, here's one way we might think about discernment. It's pretty radical when you think about it. This is from the healthcare system where I was board chair. This is how we describe the idea of discernment to our executives. Discernment's about opening ourselves up to seek God's will for us and determining what's best in terms of our mission and core values and the continuation of the healing ministry of Jesus, which was our quote unquote business. You would substitute our parish, our school, whatever it may be. And before we go on, I just want to maybe underscore or point out the radical nature of what we think we're all doing when we say we're discerning something. Because I guess a lot of us, we're on boards or on committees or are very involved members of a parish, a school, whatever it may be. And when decisions come up, we often tend to think, our job is to reach the best decision we can as a group, using my skills as a lawyer, my skills as a banker, whatever it may be. But I don't think we often explicitly put on the table the idea I've highlighted in this definition, namely that God, in some mysterious way, maybe has a plan for this ministry, and our job is, of course, to use our heads. That's one way we understand God's will for our ministry, what seems to make sense, but also to try to open ourselves up to discerning, where may be God trying to lead us at this moment? And on the next slide, Laura, I've laid out a few steps that I would consider part of a good discerning mindset in life in general, but in decisions in particular. We're going to march our way through all of these. The first three we're going to do pretty quickly because they're very obvious. And then we're going to slow down as we get to number 4. And I'll see if we have time for number 5. We'll play that by ear. So in order to be more discerning in our approach to our own life, in our approach to what to do for the parish or the school or JP Morgan, if that's where I work, could I acquire these kinds of practices outlined on this page? And let's go to the next slide. Laura, here, when I say daily reflection, here's a very abbreviated notion of what Jesuits call an examen. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, where we take a couple of breaks each day and we try to sit and reflect over the day and listen in our hearts and minds and spirits to what God may be trying to convey to us. And here's how I relate that to discernment. The idea of discernment is going to be that we're somehow going to try to attune ourselves to how God, in a subtle way, might be trying to communicate with us. And what in the world makes us imagine that even though we never pray, other than intercessory prayer, prayer of petition, prayer at Mass, all of which is important, but if we have no habit of trying to pray quietly, contemplatively, listen to the Lord, what in the world makes us think that all of a sudden, on this one day of the year where we now have to start making a big decision, we're just going to all of a sudden be able to do it well? I mean, what would make me think, for example, that even though I've not worked hard in medical school, I'm going to show it up in the operating room, somebody's going to hand me a scalpel and I'm going to do a good surgery? So my first point about our discerning mindset is far outside of, before, after decisions we want to make in a discerning way. We need to flex our muscles and practice our prayerful listening skills. So that's the first idea. Second idea, Laura, I've cribbed this from Saint Ignatius in his spiritual exercises, he tells us another thing we ought to do when we take major decisions is to kind of redo the decision or process the decision multiple ways using multiple kind of techniques. So, for example, all of us are probably familiar with this first approach. Gee, should we build onto the parish hall? Should we start this new youth program? Should we do this or that? And so we sit and we maybe jot down pros and cons. Maybe we look at the financial aspects of it, and then we have a debate. And of course we should do all that. But maybe as part of our process, we should also do this second thing. Let's reread our values and mission, maybe even pray a bit over the mission and see what specific light that now sheds on this question. If it's a personal decision, or even an organizational one, maybe I want to do the third point. Let me consult a spiritual director or a mentor, and let me describe for them what I'm thinking, considering, what's going on inside me. Not that they'll tell me their intellectual solution to my problem, but that they're going to help me in a prayerful way to order, understand my own thinking. And last idea I might share now, which is the worst one. Nobody ever likes this one. Imagine we're on our deathbed, looking back over our whole life, and we look at this decision and think, gee, what would I wish I had done at that time? I say nobody likes it because this one always delivers the wrong answer. You know, I mean, we want to do what we want to do. But if we think about it sometimes in these very dramatic ways, we sometimes get confronted with ways of doing things that we're not happy about. So that's a second kind of idea that will make us more discerning decision makers. Here's a third one on the next slide, Laura. We're going to listen to colleagues. This is from the discernment manual of our health system. And I'm just going to let you read through this slide, skim it very quickly, but then I'm going to make a comment about it. Now, first, this obviously is applying mostly to group decisions. So like if it's a parish council, as opposed to a personal decision where there's usually not other people involved. And I guess I just want to make this observation that let me use the example of my corporate life at JP Morgan. We had what I would call a rather Darwinian approach to discussing things. We would all come into a room, we would argue, and our belief about decision making was whoever has the most persuasive arguments is putting forward the best idea, and that's the way we should go. And that's a very legitimate way of thinking. But in our spiritual traditions, in a discerning way, we actually don't think that at all. Rather, our mindset in the room has to be that, you know, God may work in God's spirit through anybody sitting here. And so my job, if this is the person who doesn't really articulate things very well, my job is not to say to myself, oh, great, now I can easily knock down their ideas because they're not very eloquent and I'm faster on my feet. My job is to help each person make the best version of their argument, their case, and to try to be listening for, okay, where might God be speaking here? So it's a very unique way of thinking about the role that we're all playing when we're sitting together discussing. And by the way, if you're the pastor, head of the parish council, head of the school board, whatever it may be, before a decision starts, maybe it's your job, not maybe, it is your job to try to get our heads operating correctly not in a Darwinian way of let me knock down everybody's input, but in this kind of way that tries to listen for the Spirit's wisdom wherever it might emerge. Laura, let's skip the next slide, and now let's go on to the fourth idea. I'm going to slow down a bit because now this is a slightly more complicated notion. This really is, I think, one of the most powerful notions in Ignatian and the Christian spiritual tradition. I find it 100% relevant, whether to business decisions, personal decisions, institutional, faith-based decisions, whatever it may be, but it's often overlooked. So I'm going to take 2 or 3 slides to unpack it a bit. So in the spiritual exercises, Ignatius says, whenever we face a choice, now I quote, before we get into the middle of it, we ought not to lean or incline in either direction, but rather, standing by like the point of a scale at equilibrium, be open to whatever way the evidence points, whatever way God is calling us. His idea, in other words, is that often, by the time we get into the middle of discussing, debating, thinking through the decision, our mind is already halfway up and made up. Because of, let's skip a slide, Laura, and go to the car. Because of what I call the inner baggage that's getting in our way and hobbling our ability to weigh the evidence properly in a rational way and be guided only by what's best for the mission. And I'm going to talk in a moment about what I mean by inner baggage. The basic idea is, can we render ourselves internally free, would be another way to think about it. Able to go in whichever way the Spirit leads us, instead of coming to the decision polluted by all of this inner baggage, unfreedoms, inordinate attachments, to use the clunky phrase that Ignatius used in the spiritual exercises. And of course, we each have our own baggage. My issues are different from yours. But there are many classic things that tend to get in the way of being able to make good decisions. And the next slide, Laura, lays out a handful of those. So for example, could we get ourselves free from our own pride? In other words, I'm in the group and the discussion starts and somebody doesn't like my idea and I start digging in. Maybe my idea is actually not the best idea, but I'm so hung up on my own pride. I want to win. I have to have it my way, my ego, that it's rendering me unfree, unable to be open to what we want to discover in terms of God's will. Or I won't go through each of these on this page. You could look at them. The fear of making a mistake, the fear of trying something new. Remember, I opened the whole presentation by talking about the world of VUCA in which we're now living. VUCA, the world is changing around us, means that we're often going to have to change too. The way we do this process, that process, the way we try to figure out how the heck are we going to engage young people and young adults and prevent teenagers from leaving us. That's going to require new ways of thinking. But when we get into the room to discuss and discern possible ways forward, we might be hobbled by our attachments to our inner fears, fear of making a mistake. Oh man, what if we get it wrong? Or no, we can't try something new. We kind of are used to the way we've done it before, or we have to do it this way because St. Joe Parish does it that way, and all this kind of stuff. This I find really the most powerful of the tools I'm going to share today. And so the follow-up would be for each of us individually before we entertain some major decision, should I marry the person? Should I take the new job? Should I buy the new house? Before I start sifting through the evidence, I'm first going to prayerfully sit back and say, if I'm not careful, is there inner junk that could hobble me here, get in the way of being open to the best decision? If we're a group at parish council thinking about, should we change the mass schedule? Maybe before having the debate, we also try personally and as a group to say, are there any things here that if we're not careful could get in the way of being spirit-led and making a good choice? Laura, we're getting close to the time. We're not quite there, but we're getting close. So I think I'm going to give a little bit of short shrift to this next idea. I'll mention it just briefly. Sure. When we get Q&A, we could certainly go back further over it. For now, I'll just introduce it a little bit. You could go to the next page. This fifth idea is about something that's also pretty tricky, probably the trickiest, most difficult to understand and implement. And to tee it up, I often ask people, gee, have you ever had an experience where a feeling of inner peace or courage helped to convince you that a really difficult decision was actually the correct one? I sometimes use this example from my own life. My mother died of leukemia after a wonderful life. And when she was ailing, I had to decide, should she come and live with me for a while? And man, I mean, this was going to totally turn my life upside down. It was very difficult. But I felt so peaceful and comfortable about the whole thing. That won't surprise you, of course, my mom. But it's a good example of what in our spiritual tradition, Ignatius talks about this a lot, we call consolation. And Ignatius' idea, as many of you would know, is that God's Holy Spirit often is working with us, cooperating with us, trying to help steer us or guide us by virtue of inner feelings of peace, what he calls consolation, or the opposite, anxiety or doubt, what he calls desolation. And Ignatius' idea is that's kind of like a big warning flag from the Holy Spirit. In other words, we're heading down a certain road, but we start to feel a lot of doubt about it. Gee, is this the right blah, blah? I can't quite put my finger on it. I'm not quite sure. Ignatius would say, maybe this is the way in which God's Spirit is inviting us to slow down, pray more carefully, analyze what we thought of. I say this is really difficult because it's hard to read what's consolation, what's false consolation, what's confusing. So in other words, I just use the idea of feeling consoled, feeling courageous, feeling positive. Well, if I walk down the street and go to a bar and I'm half drunk and this woman, I'm married, this woman is flirting with me and she's half drunk and things seem to be going down a certain road, maybe I'm starting to feel, wow, this would be pretty good. That's not consolation. So we need to learn this, what I call a spiritual technology. Those car commercials that sometimes say they have this little thing after this guy's driving around bendy mountains and it says, a driver on a closed course, don't try this alone. I sometimes say that about learning to read spirits well. It takes practice. Being with a good spiritual mentor can help. If you skip a slide, Laura, you'll see I have referenced here a tab, next slide, perfect. You'll see I have referenced here on this website, ignatianspirituality.com. Making Good Decisions is a tab they have, which could be another way of introducing this spiritual technology of being able to read consolation and desolation. Okay, I've given a quick run through how our spiritual traditions might help us to be better decisions in this VUCA complex world. And I'm very interested in our discussion, but before we get on to that, since I've kind of launched a lot of ideas quickly, let me invite Laura to put us into small groups. And while she's doing that, I'm going to mention one other thing, so don't let us go, Laura, yet. And the task for each group, we're only going to give you 3 or 4 minutes. The task for each group is just going to be, well, what struck you? What was something that I said that was provocative, interesting, very relevant, wrong-headed? And then we'll come back and we'll have Q&A. But before we go into the groups, let me do 2 pieces of advertising. One, Laura mentioned that on March 9th, Renew has put together a day-long workshop on how we connect our spiritual life to our daily work. I'm going to be speaking, Carolyn Wu. There'll be other sessions. So you're most welcome to that. It's March 9th, and it'll be easy to sign up. I'll make another little commercial. Those of you who are familiar with Renew are familiar with the parish discussion technology idea that they promote, where small groups in a parish work their way through a book or a resource. And I authored one of those books that are sometimes used by Renew parish groups called What Me Holy. And if your parish, if your Renew group wants at any point to do a discussion of this text, I'd be more than happy to zoom in to one of your sessions and to discuss it with you and colleagues. Now, with that, Laura, why don't we take 3-4 minutes at most for small group chats where people could share what's struck them so far. Then we'll all come back together and we'll have Q&A.
Absolutely. I put the question in the chat, and you should all see an invitation to join a breakout room on your screens right now. And Chris, the breakout rooms have been invited to rejoin the main session. So they have about 34 seconds until the breakout rooms close automatically and everybody's back.
Okay. Laura, I might invite folks to either put their name in the chat box or put a question or whatever if they want to. And I guess we could even, if we can keep things under control, we could even invite folks to ask their own question, could we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And do you have 1 or 2 already teed up? Maybe not.
I have 2 or 3, yes, that were messaged to me during the conversation. And if anybody has questions now, definitely feel free to either type them in the chat box or you can unmute yourselves and ask the question yourself.
Okay. Okay. So why don't we do this? Now we have completely open forum. Your questions are most welcome. Your comments are most welcome. If you want to give us a tiny flavor of what went on in your group, that's fine. We only have limited time though. Please don't monopolize the minutes we have. And why don't we do this? Laura, why don't you start and just ask one of the questions that you saw. Absolutely. And then while Laura is teeing up a question and I'm answering it, if anybody else in the room has a question they want to ask, just type your name and/or your name and question into the chat box, and then Laura will see it and call on you, and maybe you could vocalize your own question.
I actually see that Kelly has a question. Can we go ahead and get started with Kelly? Kelly Finn, if you'd like to go ahead and ask.
Hi, everyone. I just want to share our takeaway from our group. I was with John McGuire and Danielle. what we talked about was what discernment really means and how pursuing discernment doesn't necessarily bring us to our end goal, but being adaptable when you go down one path that you think is right and realizing that it's perhaps not what you're called to do. And then shifting is a really beautiful thing because you're able to take the learnings that you had through the journey that you went through and really see what God wants to do with that. And a good example, I mean, John, feel free to share, was perhaps spending time towards the consecrated life, whether in a convent or in a seminary, and realizing, hey, like, this is beautiful, but perhaps this isn't what I'm called to do. And then perhaps moving towards marriage and thinking, wow, look at all the skills that I have from having been formed as a man or woman of God, and then being able to offer that to your spouse.
Okay, really nice. I don't know why I presented. We should just listen to you three guys for their time. So yeah, let me just make a quick comment on that. I was a Jesuit for a few years myself, so I also recognize this kind of reality or process or discernment. And it's interesting because sometimes you make an assumption that I understand God's will or what God wants or something, and then over time maybe God teaches you, okay, look, I'm not quite sure this is where I'm really calling you. And so yeah, I very much agree with what you say. And I think your other point is important too, that we sometimes have this very bad notion of, oh, that was a mistake, or that was wrong, or I shouldn't have done that. And in the kind of example you gave from your little group there, sometimes no, that was part of a journey we should have been on, and there was learnings there that are preparing us for the next step. So that was very nice. Thanks for those comments.
Wonderful. And I'm going to present a question from Sister Laura, and then Rosa Waldron, if you'd like to jump in after Chris addresses that, the floor will be yours. So Sister Laura asked that she is wondering about your thoughts on a connection between what you present as a waterfall process and theory U.
Okay, so Sister would, and I invited her to talk, Sister would have to refresh me on theory U. I've been through theory U, not a whole workshop, but a half hour. And theory U, as I recall it, kind of maps out the discovery journey that we go through together, that eventually leads us toward understanding together direction we should go in. And I think theory U would be very consistent with some of the ideas I outlined. I don't think it would, I realize the shape of theory U is rather different than the waterfall I outlined, but I wouldn't say I feel that they are in any way contradictory. In other words, just as I said, discernment tools can be woven quite fluidly and seamlessly into a good, rational decision-making process, theory U could guide us in terms of how we're understanding the dynamic of what's going on while we're going through a decision process. But Sister Laura, if you want, I welcome you to refresh the world on.
Well, it's just thanks. The word you just used, the word dynamic, is it's that gathering the data, gathering the information, whether it's an individual or collectively. But this is, I was thinking more collectively as you were speaking. I was kind of overlaying it, but it's gathering the data, then being in that place of really just taking all that and discerning, sitting with it and having it lead to action, whatever it is, getting to that place of, you described the courage and whatever it takes to move and do a prototype, take it to action. And then you find yourself then going back because you've got this experience. So, so when I was listening and seeing the diagram, it seemed more linear.
Yeah.
And so it just got that stirring in me, and I was making the connections and wondered what you thought about it.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a either or. But just a different way of observing.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think, what you say sheds helpful light, because when I present a a waterfall, good decisions kind of go through this, 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 this. It could make people feel, oh yeah, we do A, we finish A, then we do B, we finish B, we do C, and so on. And it's not like that. I mean, as Theory, you and your observations, and even a spiritual discernment would lead us to believe, we might be at C and say, oh my gosh, we've now learned something that makes us backtrack and say, did we understand correctly or articulate correctly earlier on in the process, and so on. Yeah.
And as you're speaking, I'm just thinking of Ignatius again. Once you make a decision, you're looking for confirmation.
Nice.
So in a way, I mean, it's just different words, but encouraging that constant ongoing movement.
Yeah.
Of, and I shared with my little group that discernment's a way of being.
Yeah.
And not just, okay, now I have to make a decision and I'm going to make a decision and I'm going to discern.
Yeah.
You just kind of set it up as a way of being. So I'm grateful for what you got stirring in me today. So
yeah, a nice observation at the end. And that's, in a way, of course, that's why I started with, well, if you don't have a kind of a daily practice, we're kidding ourselves. We need to be, you say it's a way of being, could we kind of adopt, kind of work our way into a lifestyle, a way of praying that we're somehow trying to have our antenna up. Yeah. Okay, Laura.
Rosa Waldron, would you like to hop in and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Chris and sister who just spoke, because, well, I appreciate this. How it doesn't live for me as a strictly linear process. I guess I am living in the space of both and for this. And I did both, what we both shared in the small group was being struck by what you shared regarding the health issue and your mother, etc. I had a similar thing with brain aneurysms and surgery. I had done all the research, but just before, as we were walking to the OR, I felt totally grounded, calm, at peace, etc. Not resigned at all, but totally conscious, totally at peace, and knowing that this was, I'm well taken care of.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you. And I had done all the research beforehand in terms of finding out which surgeon was the best, and for my insurance, and talking to people and asking them to pray for me, all of those things. So doing the practical things as well as praying and being in the moment.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. The main question that I had was something you said earlier, when you said regarding VUCA, you feel that the way we do this process may need to change. And what struck me was that I had the assumption that the process remains the same because it's our touchstone, even though VUCA changes form, or some things are more emphasized than others in various states of VUCA. Is that so, or am I off point?
Okay, so first of all, thanks for the first part you shared, which was great. If we had more time, I'd comment on it. But I would point out, you also indirectly also validate this idea of, yeah, I did the rational stuff. I mean, that's important, but it was part of a bigger process that involved prayer as well. So thanks, you affirmed that, by the way. Now, maybe the words came out of my mouth in not exactly the right way, so it's good that you call me on it with respect to VUCA. What I think I meant to say, and then I had those follow-up slides, like the most successful people are good at plan B. What I meant to convey is that we still, a lot of us in our personal lives or in our organizational lives, kind of tend to live with this model that if we're smart people and do a good job of planning, strategizing, whatever, or thinking about a problem, we'll figure out the answer and then get on with it. And if the answer doesn't work out, it means that something was wrong. We did the decision wrong. What the heck went wrong? And I think that's just not a realistic way of processing the world we all live in now. You
Right.
know, often we made a great decision. We had a good strategy, we had a good plan, but how could we account for the fact that we were going to get punched in the face after 3 months? And, you know, for some people, there's this resistance to be willing to say, okay, look, I'm sorry. It's a new world. It's new information. The unexpected has happened. We now have to step back in freedom and say, what is the implication for us? What do we have to do? And some people don't like that, you know. But I think that's the way we all are just going to have to live.
Thank you. What I hear you saying is that sometimes there are new understandings,
Yeah,
which is important for us to take in as we examine and explore and listen for what's being called for now.
yeah, no doubt. Here's another way I would say it, which
Yes.
I once read a guy who I thought had a very interesting, clever idea about strategy. And his idea was that at the end of the day, the only real benefit of a strategy for the parish, whatever it is it gets us going. You know, we say, okay, this is where we want to go. This is important. Off we go. And when we set out, only when we're on the road, so to speak, do we start to see some of the obstacles that weren't apparent to us back at home base. And so now we've seen new things have happened, and we're able to now adjust course in a better way, which I think is a very interesting way to think about strategy.
I appreciate that. And that's what I had in mind, my understanding, and I may not have expressed it clearly. So to Sister's point who spoke previously, it is a state of being. We are can be always in the state of discernment, listening. So I thank you both for that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Do we have time, Laura, for another? You're in charge. Tell us if we have time for another, or
I think we've actually addressed all the questions that came up, unless anyone else has a question they'd like to hop in with for 2 more minutes. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or just pop your name in the chat. Give it a few seconds. Wally Kennedy, would you like to ask our final question of the day?
I have a comment more than a question.
Sure.
And so there's a group at Seton Hall, and Chris may be very familiar with this, that it's a faculty program. I'm not part of the faculty, but they've been studying the works of the Jesuit Bernard Larnagan for 10 years now. And his theories about how we learn, they're very similar to the linear model that Chris presented. And, you know, be attentive to the situation, be intelligent, and then Lonergan would say be reasonable, which is the discernment process, and then be responsible. So you go forward and learn that way. But after you learn and go forward, you encounter new things, new learnings. And he refers to it as you then loop back and start the process all over based on what you've learned. So as I look at it, nothing is really static. And you make decisions, you go forward, but as you learn, you adjust, you change, and there's really a need to be resilient at all times.
Absolutely. And Wally, thanks for joining. Of course, your work and your reputation precedes you. But I'm sorry you mentioned Bernard Lonergan, which brings back traumatic cold sweats from having to read through that stuff when I was at Fordham. But yes, I mean, what you say is truly completely right. And I guess I feel in a way also, you know, in Lonergan, we get somebody who's a supremely rational, well-trained philosopher who also is a Jesuit and who is also very much inflected with Ignatius' spirit of discernment. And I don't think Lonergan consciously is setting out to do this, but in a way, he's kind of melding these great traditions in the way you just described. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, for those comments, and to everybody who had questions. Thank you for bringing them up and making our discussion so vibrant. I'm thrilled that you all joined us today. I think that's about all the time we have, but thank you, Chris, for guiding all of our discussions and bringing us such a great presentation. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone,
Thanks,
Thank
Laura.
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.